Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbot, former Director of Operations at New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. This episode is brought to you by the team at Nuna Harvest Dispensary. Kick things off with Nuna Harvest, Westchester's go-to dispensary for premium cannabis. Top flower, edibles, and more. Visit them in-store or at nunaharvest.com. Welcome to episode 6 of season 2 of Joint Session. This is Herb Barbot, and in this episode, we'll speak with Dasheeda Dawson, former Executive Director of Cannabis NYC, an arm of New York City Small Business Services Agency. But first, let's take a spin around this week's news. The Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management announced last week that it can start to issue adult use licenses once its final adult use rules are published in the state register later this month. More than 600 pre-approved applicants for social equity licenses will have to jump through a few more hoops, including background checks and local approval for final licensure. This applicant pool will be first in line for microbusiness, wholesale, transport, lab, and delivery licenses. The lottery for remaining license types like cultivator, manufacturer, and retailer, which have license limits, will be held sometime this summer, according to OCM. Those lotteries are open to all applicants. Good luck, Minnesota. The Minnesota Adult Use Law was signed in 2023. The American Beverage Licensees, a group that represents bar, tavern, and packaged liquor store owners, released a memo this month on THC drinks. The ABL supports comprehensive state regulatory frameworks for intoxicating THC products that prioritize public safety and align with proven alcohol regulatory models. Beverage alcohol retailers with many decades of proven compliance are best positioned to sell these products, the memo notes. The group's members include Anheuser-Busch, the Beer Institute, the National Beer Wholesalers Association, and Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America, all groups that have become more and more vocal on cannabis over the years. Given their considerable experience with beverage alcohol regulation, beverage alcohol retailers are best positioned to not only sell these products, but also to provide practical advice to states on how to implement a robust regulatory model that inherently balances public safety, business interest, and consumer access, said ABL Executive Director John Botnovich in the announcement. The Yale Law Journal recently published a collection of essays and articles titled Decriminalizing Drugs. Like many adult use advocates in New York have been stating, the opening essay argues that even if the rescheduling process picks up and proceeds, Schedule 3 for cannabis is profoundly insufficient. First, given the known safety and risk profiles of cannabis in 1970, it was unscientific and frankly outrageous for Congress to place cannabis on Schedule 1 and thereby regulate it more strictly than substances like cocaine and methamphetamine. Second, the recent rescheduling proposal does nothing to decriminalize recreational cannabis use. It thus perpetuates rather than mitigates cannabis criminalization's racist and nativist origins, as well as its long-standing and ongoing desperate impacts on Black and Brown Americans, the author wrote. Finally, the proposed rescheduling rule undermines federal-state comity, given the massive uptick in state cannabis legalization over the last decades. The proposed scheme largely leaves in place untenable federal-state conflict while creating additional novel problems for legalization jurisdictions in cannabis businesses. To hear more about cannabis criminalization's racist and nativist origins, listen to our previous episode, number 5, Cannabis Prohibition by Historical Context. As always, thanks to Cannabis Wire for that news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. My guest today is Dasheeda Dawson, most recently the founding director of Cannabis NYC, which is an arm of New York City government, where she worked to guide the development of the cannabis industry in New York City. Immediately prior to that, she was the Cannabis Program Manager for the city of Portland, Oregon. Dasheeda is also the co-founder and board chair of the National Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. Welcome, Dasheeda.
Thank you so much for having me, Herb. I'm so excited to finally be able to circle back with you after our first conversation while I was still in role.
Well, no, and thank you for coming back. So now, I reached out to you a couple of weeks ago just to catch up, find out what's going on with New York City, possibly have you back on to talk about what's going on with the city and the city's efforts. And then within a day, you had resigned, which was disappointing. But and then I reached out again and said, don't worry about it. We'll catch up in the coming weeks. But you did reach out and you did want to come on, so thank you for doing that. So we want to talk about all the work that you did in New York City, and then some of the most recent news, if you don't mind. So first of all, can you talk about what you did in Portland, Oregon?
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, Portland was my first transition into the government side. Prior to that, I had done a lot of management consulting and strategy consulting work within the space, in particular for very large multi-state operators as well as some independent small businesses. So I'd seen the gamut, even Native American tribes. And I also had government as a client as well, many new markets trying to figure out the framework. During COVID, I got pulled into action, if you will, on the public servant side, and I gladly answered the call. So being in government during COVID was already a challenge, but also recognizing that Portland had all of these laws in place, local and state statute, that would allow for community reinvestment and some restorative justice component, but it wasn't actually being implemented. When I arrived, more than 80% of the local cannabis tax revenue was actually going back to the police department and public safety, which felt a little bit like a slap in the face, considering the legalization efforts were really about how do we restore those communities that were over policed and or harmed from the war on drugs. And so my first real historic things were really about shifting that cannabis tax revenue from going to public safety to 80% going to community organizations, specifically serving those communities that have been most harmed in the Portland market. And that included indigenous communities, obviously, as well as other Black and Brown communities. And so it was great to see for the first time certain indigenous organizations getting money from government that was related to the work that they were already doing. This was called our Social Equity and Educational Development, or SEED initiative. So I branded it and really expanded it. And in a matter of time, there were multiple millions of dollars that were going out in this grant fund to organizations already doing this work on the ground. The last thing I'll say in Portland is that I established the Emergency Relief Fund. COVID was really doing a number on businesses, small businesses, in fact. And at the federal level, they had a lot of relief funds. But of course, with the illegalities of cannabis, this was not allowed for cannabis businesses to really take advantage. Even hemp businesses, which were federally legal, were struggling with the SBA in
So
trying to get.
they couldn't apply for the same kind of grants and loans that
No.
any other business could.
No relief, but at the same time deemed essential services, right?
Mm.
And so we saw a lot of struggle there, and we established from the cannabis tax revenue, which wasn't allocated yet because it was growing every year, a multi-million dollar cannabis emergency relief fund, or SURF, which was able to be partnered with New Project, another nonprofit that had already been supporting Black and Brown companies in cannabis, to be able to give loans to people who were struggling during this time.
And when you say that were deemed essential services, I know what that meant in New York State. It seemed meant the same thing out in Oregon, was that those businesses could open while other businesses had to remain shut. Like the businesses that were deemed essential services. Like in New York State, liquor stores were deemed essential services.
Absolutely. Cannabis was the same in Oregon, and a lot of people were trying to still function during COVID with new rules on, distancing and drive up. I think even at the time, drive up wasn't necessarily an established thing in Oregon, and we had to make in Portland an emergency rule around how to use drive up windows and curbside pickup. It forced the Oregon market, which was technically already very mature in that it had legalized a while ago for adult use. It forced it to move itself forward, which I feel like it should have already been. Why don't we already have curbside pickup before COVID? But COVID did push the initiative around making these businesses more effective for consumer services, as well as support it during a time where every other business was getting support from the government.
All right. So how does this experience in Portland inform, your approach when you came to New York and founded Cannabis NYC?
Well, first of all, I had already been in New York on the ground as an
Mhm.
advocate and an educator, and I was doing contract work in New York as well. And so I was very familiar with, and some would say part of the push to legalize, and behind the
Mhm.
continued advancement of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. So, in some ways, New York legalizing was very much a celebration for me and my family being from East New York and understanding the impact there. When the state came calling and saying, "Hey, would you consider this city role?" And then eventually the city came calling. It felt like a natural transition. At this point, I'd already done nearly 3 years in Portland. I'd learned a lot in Portland. I also owned licensing and compliance, so had inspectors and really a mini version of what we know the New York State Office of Cannabis Management was.
Mhm.
And in some ways, even though I knew I wouldn't own licensing, I fought against that actually. And we could talk about why. But I knew I still owned a really large amount of resource allocation that needed to happen and support technical assistance. And New York City would be critical for New York State to be successful. And so I didn't want it to just be any old thing. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I wanted it to, be very meaty and establish something from the ground that would set
Mhm.
the bar high. And so I came back with the knowledge that we would be following the state's lead on the efforts on, the MRTA and equity, and New York City would do its part to ensure that people had support entering the market, but also understanding what was happening with the market.
Now, what specific initiatives did you prioritize in New York City?
Well, the very first one that I learned from Portland was you can be legalized for many years, but people still fear or have a canophobia around the actual plant. So it was funny to me that Portland had been legal for so long, but yet the communities and the government didn't talk about it. They had not done any public education. So the very first thing I felt was critical, especially in light of the illegal stores that were popping up, was public education. We needed to make sure that every area of the five boroughs, particularly those most harmed, got information about what the new law was, what did that mean for them as far as rights, what was it far as consumption, what was the medical program, how did it change, and what's a legal store versus not, and how do they also get a license if they want it. So there was a lot of, with the plant, a full spectrum, pun intended, of things that people needed to learn. And the public education tour liftoff campaign was something that I literally, came up with the first day I was in the role. I felt like we've got to get to all five boroughs. I want to do it authentically though. And so it became clear that I didn't want just government to come and make events. Those tended not to do well. I wanted to partner with the people who had again already been on the ground in the trenches during the time to legalize, had a real intentionality around servicing these particular communities, could bring the tribe and the vibe, and we could bring the education. So we prioritized that right away. And that kicked off within my first 6 months of being enrolled, February 2023. The second priority was technical assistance. We had the card application that was open. It was the first real application for New York City residents because conditional cultivation and conditional processing came through a different channel. And so we really wanted to make sure that we supported those applicants. And then, of course, a lot of changes started to happen as the application and the approvals rolled out. By the time the beginning of 2023 started, we're now worried about whether or not we will even see the market roll
Mhm.
out as we want, injunctions. And so that technical support to keep people afloat, keep people motivated, ensure that they are forming the right partnerships. We started car networking events at the SBS offices, but I also launched Fast Track for Cannabis Entrepreneurs, a free 10-week entrepreneurial course. It was a piggyback of something that already existed, but took a while to get that contract updated. You know how the logistics of government are. And then we trained a cannabis account managers for our 7 business solution centers around the 5 boroughs so that people can go in and they're like, I want to start a cannabis business, not necessarily a licensed one, but anyone. And they would
Mhm.
have someone that was trained with us monthly on the regulations and the rules to be able to help and assist.
And can you tell me a little bit about the loan program that was established as well?
So that's the last but not least. I wanted to take a breath for it because it's a
Okay.
big deal,
Right, right,
to
right.
be able to get the money before the tax revenue starts to flow in.
Mhm.
And that was something I wasn't able to do in other markets or wasn't able to see done in other markets. And so New York City saying very early, like one of the first jobs I had was to go in front of the Office of Management and Business Budget with the EDC and really prepare why we needed to invest before the market started. So the Cannabis NYC Loan Fund was really an almost 2-year process that started from day one with getting the $8 million earmarked in the budget that went to EDC. And then the very next process was selecting a loan administrator and capital partners if they came along. We selected Tuatara, who's a bit of a hybrid of both. And in November of, or rather October of 2024, we were finally able to launch the first application portal offering phase one loans to card only. That took some time and support to really push that. We had $2 million allocated to card for up to $100,000 in loans, 9.5% as the rate, literally fighting tooth and nail every day to make sure that we keep this rate reasonable, because in my mind government rates should be zero, but the prime was raising every day as we were talking. And these are things that licensees don't know about and businesses don't know about. They just know about what their cost is. And so my job was really continue to inform them of the market, who the target demographic was, what their challenges were, and trying to create that product that would work for them. And I would give us a B plus. And maybe I'm saying B plus because we got the money out, as you know, in a reasonable time. There are other markets still waiting for money to go out, and they've been around a lot longer. But I really still feel like there are challenges with creating equitable constructs in an inequitable framework. It, you
Well,
know,
and just to clarify, you mentioned EDC, which is another arm of New York City government. It's the Economic Development Corporation,
yeah.
and they had the contract to establish the loan requirement and hire the loan administrator.
Hmm. They did.
I'm sorry.
I say, yep, they did.
Okay, and how many loans have been made? You know.
To be truthful, when I was at the point of departure, we had found, I believe, maybe 9 to 10 to fund. They had not yet been made, but the point was more so that they were approved and ready to move forward to the next phase. Believe it or not, this fund very different from the DASNY fund
Mhm.
in that the money actually goes into the bank account for the loan recipient. And that was actually becoming the next challenge, which was how do we get the banks to accept the 100K? What does it look like when you have an account control agreement with the bank? They were, many of these banks are starting to upcharge for just that. It was actually a lot more that we were learning as we were starting to do this disbursement. And I'm sure the city is still learning as we go.
Mhm.
But I was
We actually have an upcoming episode just on cannabis and banking. The challenges there, so completely
it's
understand.
insane. The banking industry is already lopsided, right?
Hmm.
And then add to it this, and then if you cannabis and you're a minority owned or cannabis or woman owned, you struggle even more. And also the deals that they're offering feel so, astronomical compared to
Hmm.
the actual work that's required.
So now that you finished in Portland, you finished in New York City, can you compare the two markets?
Absolutely. I would say New York has more overt cannabis culture. The Liftoff tour immediately became a hit. One of the biggest stops on the tour is the parade and rally and parade and festival. Now we took over for the 50th anniversary of this annual event, and it really started to blow up. We have a lot of people who are comfortable in New York celebrating the culture. And I feel like cannabis culture is most prevalent here in a way that is just part of our community and in our engagement. Whereas with Portland, while it is on the low, part of the wellness community, very much so, it isn't celebrated in the same way. It's
Mm.
kind of a, if you know, you know. It still feels, considering we were calling it Potland when I was at least, getting to know the market, it didn't feel like Portland at all. It still felt very conservative. Literally every time I went in front of the Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, I was still defending legalization. To the point one time I said to a commissioner, I was like, listen, it's already legalized. The law is passed. I'm here to regulate. So we're not going to talk about legalization every time I come back with an update for you all. Which then made me a popular person at the commission meetings because it's like, oh, she's telling it like it is. But it was really crazy to me that so long it had been medical and adult use, and yet so many people still not as educated, not as celebratory, not as understanding of the multicultural history with the plant. And we have that almost naturally, even though we might have, grandparents and multi-generational trauma, there's still a story that people can pull from to say, oh, I remember when my grandma used to put that in her tea. She wouldn't want me to sell weed, but she's still making something in her tea. We have that. And I think I really leaned in on it. And it was great to be able to enter into communities that normally don't trust government and gain their trust and gain their support. That has been critical through to my resignation and moving even into the next phase of what the work will be. The last thing I will also say is the leap up in sales. All of these illegal stores that happen in every single market. Everybody always will operate. Anybody who's an opportunist will find a way to operate in the gray if there is gray to operate in. That happened in every legal store. I have to legal market. I have to continue to say that, even in Portland. But I do feel like Portland's sales overall, as compared to what New York City is driving in the market, New York City and Long Island, if you add that to, is like comparing a watermelon New York City to an orange, in terms of what can be squeezed out of it and the size and the like. I do think that I enjoyed that there's health and wellness components of cannabis more prevalent in the culture in Portland. And that's what I'm looking forward to seeing in New York a little bit more.
And that appears to be growing in New York.
Definitely. There are a lot of individual brands and influencers, certainly. But I think even as you look at Renaissance, for example, which is a dispensary that was, started by someone who has their degree in biochemistry. And of course, yes, victim of the war on drugs. Card, she is the directly impacted, but she still, was able to utilize her science background to create an environment that does feel more like a vibe of health and wellness, or, well-being at least.
All right. So yeah, I'd like to pivot and talk a little bit about the New York Times article, and then come back and talk about some of the issues facing the state. Right.
Mhm.
Now, the New York Times recently had an article concerning allegations made against you, and they tried to tie in. That they didn't try. They tied in the investigation with your resignation. So what's your response to that?
It's what I've been saying since the story hit, which fortunately was right before April Fools. Uh, it's not related. I resigned because I had done 90 to 95% of a 3-year strategy where we set out to do some very specific things, the largest and most difficult being the Cannabis NYC loan fund. And those things had already started to be in motion to kind of moving into the next phase, already creating the next 3-year strategy. But in truth, it was also really looking at what's happening at the state level. How can I be more impactful beyond the local jurisdiction? Although New York City is very important, there's so much else, happening that are potential challenges that are outside of New York City. Having an opinion on that and wanting to really be able to say it with my chest, if you will. And as you know, with government, even though I was and will probably always be an outspoken government official, the fact is there's still protocol as to how you can talk about other jurisdictions and interact with constituents about the other jurisdictions. And technically, the state is a different jurisdiction from the city. And so I started to see that as a real challenge overall if I wanted to really start to make an impact. I believe part of what has been my journey, the almost 10 years in cannabis, has been my voice and my leadership. And, when I first started in the role at Cannabis NYC, I was going to the CCB, or the Cannabis Control Board meetings, every month and giving public comment every month.
Remember.
You recall. And that became something that was a little bit more challenging. Again, the more bureaucratic the processes became, but also a change in leadership. The commissioner that brought me in was not the commissioner that I resigned from under. And although that commissioner is great, it really was a matter of time and the opportunity. We're winding down on session. We still don't have a executive director in place. People outside of New York are actually talking about it pretty regularly and asking that question. Definitely.
Executive director at the state level.
Yes, an executive director at state level. And it became clear that there was an opportunity there. And I still believe there's an opportunity there. But I do think that I don't understand why the Times would take something that really it is allegations that have no proof, and based on just the city's efforts, not my own, did not move forward with the finalizing of an investigation, and pair it with something that is today's news with my resignation.
Okay.
The last thing I'll say, Herb, is that I also feel very strongly that I resigned with internally enough runway for my team to feel like they could move forward. And, I really want to shout out Tosi Ajayi, who's been my second in command and really supporting the efforts. I think the writing was on the wall every time we go to an event and people are like, are you going to go to the state? Are you going to go to the state? My team was starting to pick up the vibe. And so I do feel like there was internal conversations, but because I said I wanted to rest and recharge, because I said I wanted to rest. I think as a Black woman, we're not allowed to do that without scrutiny. And I have to be honest, that's how I sort of felt. I didn't rest between Portland and New York. My first day in New York was my last day in Portland. I didn't give myself a proper break. And I think if I'm going to do bigger jobs, which they are, all of them from this point on are bigger jobs, I need the opportunity to rest, recharge, and go in full throttle, because it's going to be a fight, an uphill battle, no matter what.
Yeah, no, and I don't think people realize, I mean, with these jobs, especially when it's a starting agents, right, which doesn't happen. I mean, it just doesn't happen. You're working all day and then you're out all evening at the official events. Definitely. Saying that there's nothing to the allegations and that there won't be further allegations.
I don't believe that it referred to allegations. I think these were bogus to begin with. I
Okay.
felt like even the story, it was like, she said this, there was nothing to prove that that was the case. Yes, it is true. They filed a complaint. Anyone can file a complaint the same way anyone can file a lawsuit. In fact, if you want to be a nuisance to a public official that maybe did something or you think did something, the complaint system is how people will harass public officials. I feel like being a public servant by choice has, in some ways, especially in cannabis, it puts a mark on your back for people to be able to come after you. But I never knew the details of also the complaint. I want to reiterate, because we talk about process a lot here on your show, that when you have a EEO investigation, it's anonymous or it is confidential. All they say is someone accused you of something, and these are the buckets that it falls into. The buckets were wild. Sexual harassment, that buckets were wild to me. So I thought to myself, this is crazy. No problem. I'm going to follow all of the things. They only outlined the process. They never followed through the process. I never got a conversation. I never got an interview. I never got any details. So the New York Times article is the first time that I'm hearing who the person is, right? And what they're actually alleging I did. And even more ridiculous, I feel for people that have to leverage a platform in order to get any type of notoriety. And I also have to call out the New York Times to some degree, because if I wasn't a person of interest, this would not be a story. Something that was last year's news, last year's complaint, paired with this year's resignation.
Right, right. I mean, according to the article, it was a complaint that was filed last spring in 2024. And just since we do talk about process, what is the process for contracting at the SBS or the Small Business Services or Cannabis NYC? Just it's not one person that makes a decision, right?
It isn't. And it's also not me to sign the contracts as the general counsel. But what I will also say is just because someone's working with government doesn't mean they have a contract. More often than not, if you saw someone doing things for Cannabis NYC, they were volunteering. And I want to shout out to everyone. When I say we did this is what I mean. I mean that there were countless organizations and companies that volunteered to participate as, vendors, exhibitors, moving around tables and tents for our liftoff tour. But I also want to, acknowledge that there is a process. If you're doing something that's considered very small, like less than $20,000, a micro, there's a lesser process than there is for a $500,000 or $1 million. Most of the contracts with Cannabis NYC, 20,000 or less. It wasn't, intricate RFPs until this year, last year rather. I launched an RFP for the Liftoff Tour, and many of the volunteers, it doesn't guarantee that you get a contract, right? Mm-hmm. But it does help us know who you are. It helps with credibility. It does help that process, but many of those volunteer organizations did apply. This person who accuses me of this stuff didn't apply for anything, and didn't put themselves in a process of RFP to actually get a contract there. What I actually think is also more interesting than not is that contracts were made with their company, but not the one that they're even mentioning in the New York Times article. There are so many holes, Herb, for me. And I'm doing my best to move on. It hasn't really, I'm unscathed, really unbothered by it. And there's so many digital techniques you can do to remove it from a search. I am a digital strategist, so that'll get handled. But I think most people saw it for what it was, which was a hit piece in some ways to make someone who is a very good candidate for state level roles look like they have some dirt on them in some capacity. Because without this, you have a 25-year, work history and a 10-year one in cannabis that is pretty exemplary, and it will remain so at this point.
All right, so let's look at the state and the Office of Cannabis Management. What do you think are the most pressing challenges facing that agency at the moment?
Well, not for nothing. I'll go right to the elephant in the room. The December queue is a big issue. But there are so many challenges. Is one of those things where it's a Venn diagram a little bit on how some of them overlap with each other. Mm-hmm. And so I start with the December queue because my experience with Cannabis NYC is very community facing, and it's the first thing you get, which are agitated, disgruntled applicants that feel like they've had no communication, no real understanding, lawsuits happening, and media telling a story.
And so when you say the December queue, please explain what you're referring to.
Yes, thank you so much. I forget that I'm not just talking to you, I'm talking to your audience. And the December queue is the description of an applicant pool that came in December of 2023. And now we're in 2025. Largely, we're focused when we say December queue on retail and micro business licensee hopefuls. And essentially, these people are still waiting to find out whether or not they will be approved or provisionally approved for a license. Another important thing to note about the December queue is most of these people applied not because they couldn't make the November deadline or the November queue, but because they did not have a actual location for their retail establishment or their micro business with retail. And so they applied as
was required for the November queue.
Yes, which was required for the November queue. Absolutely. And so we see in our office at Cannabis NYC, we were talking about it a lot. And so I would say now my personal opinion is that this December queue represents a large majority of social and economic equity applicants that did not have the resources to already have a location in ownership or under lease, and definitely didn't have the resources to put themselves on a lease and wait from 2023 to 2025 to hear if they got a license. These are the folks who were in real belief of the state when they said, you will get a shot. There's no difference. We have this number coming from November and this number coming from December, which was supposed to be a larger number, by the way. And then, through 2024, that all changed. I do think credibility was lost in the office, certainly. And that's why I don't think it's just about December Q, meaning those applicants, but it's what do people think largely here and other states about how the Office of Cannabis Management is managing the entire process. And I think these type of things where you say one thing on the record is it's still recorded in a CCB meeting, and then 3 months later it's a new thing and a new thing and a new thing.
And I think another big issue that you're hearing a lot about now is the concern about inversion in the state's failure to just get the seed to sale program off the ground.
I don't know if I agree with that as a failure. I think we have to kind of ensure that we are definitely uh, dispelling the myths. Most states, from the point of legalization, meaning just the law passed, to the point of the first sale, is about a 2 to 2.5 year time period. And New York did that in the same time period.
Mhm.
How many outlets we can have, I think that was the potential challenge there. But I will also go back to things that I learned in Oregon's market. One, biomass and good product, if done with good storage, can last a very long time as far as harvest is concerned. When we were in Portland, we were seeing harvests on the shelf that were more than a year or two old. Of course, you want the freshest harvest, but I feel like they had, as cultivators, more insight on how to maintain their materials, and
Mhm.
that quickly was evident that New York State didn't necessarily have that. So it showed also a technical assistance and education gap, maybe on
Mhm.
the cultivators. A lot of assumption was if you can cultivate hemp, then you can cultivate marijuana or high THC cannabis. And in some ways, it kind of is true if you were cultivating hemp for CBD or hemp for cannabinoids. There's an analogous process, but most of the hemp cultivators in New York State were not doing that necessarily. And so I think that was also one of the things that kept coming to mind as we have a gap in the education on how to actually preserve the product that gets cultivated in the state while we figure this out. And then, yes, the DASNY promise was very much hailed as like a big win, and it was hailed as a win before it actually rolled out. And in the midst of rolling it out, you could see right away the cracks in it, just how many pop-ups, that's where they started versus real stores, the fact that they were focused on the flagship big old stores, when in truth a New York real weed experience is a much smaller footprint. Actually, if you think about it from a cannabis culture perspective, it didn't make sense that we were already building these supermarket type stores for cannabis before really having the market behind us.
Right. No, and you mentioned this earlier, and I said it at the time, is the interest rate, right? The prime rate was changing. That was at the very same time as the rates were going from like 3.5% to like even 8, 9%. And there should have been a change in course just when that happened. Um, any specific policy recommendations that you would make to the Office of Cannabis Management?
Gosh, I have so many, and I don't think we have enough time for them all. But I do think
Yeah,
I've been saying,
one or two.
yes, I've been saying, because I mentioned the December queue as a big hot topic. Again, it's not the only issue. There are some functionality issues in terms of function groups and who does what inside the office. Is it always clear? And there's been a lot of movement, obviously, with the leadership. But far as December queue is concerned, I feel still very strongly that we got to give back people's agency. They chose to stand in this line thinking that they would have a decision sooner rather than later. It was a chance with $500 or $1,000. But now, fast forward to 2025, when this was a 2023 application, it's time to offer people the opportunity potentially to get their money back, step out of the line if they want to. I think we should clear some of the noise of the December queue, the noise of complaints, but also people who are just in the queue many times, maybe played a bit of the game there on how many times they would be included and not for the social and economic equity priority. We can start to deduplicate some of that and also have people walk away. And I think it will reduce the number, at least, that we're working with at the state level, which might make it easier for the OCM to see better how to, get through it or process it.
Mm.
Um, I don't know a lot about what's happening with the ROs that were like previously existing. I know a lot of them are not operating the same hours anymore, and we are seeing even more underserved and unserved locations. And so I know that there's
On the medical cannabis side.
yes, on the medical cannabis side, a lot of them seem upset that they're not able to have gotten to the adult use market. But there's so much money being left on the ground and also
Mm.
opportunity in the medical market. So I would also be making a lot of effort there to fortify the support and the education. And we do focus a lot on this social equity fund and the money they must pay in to get into the adult use market. I would look at maybe there's also education and other community related things that can be paid in, if you will, to get to the adult use market. I feel like if you can't treat the medical market with the respect and the dignity that it needs and deserves, then it doesn't make sense to start, putting people towards the adult use market, which is still largely being used for medicinal purposes. So I think they should be leading the charge on that, and they're not. And I would implement policy that helps to incentivize them in the right way to pick up the money that they're leaving on the table, but also support the communities that really need it on the cannabis as medicine piece.
Now, you came from a jurisdiction that the localities had a lot more authority, right? A lot more power than they do in New York State, and now you just left New York City, where again the locality doesn't have as much influence over policy. Would you recommend a change in that? Would you want localities to have more say in how this is rolled out?
I was an advocate for no licensing at the local level in New York City because it created such an additional hurdle, financial and bureaucratic hurdle for licensees. But even in Portland, we would license people in less than 6 weeks, and people were on the line waiting for the state for 2 years. So we also were giving them false hope. It was almost like in an amusement park. Remember back in the day, you could do the first wraparound and then you get around the corner and there's a whole nother wraparound that's even longer. I didn't like that feeling of having to disappoint people. So I pushed back on it because I saw it as another barrier of entry for those who were most harmed by the war on drugs. But I also think that there is a process for the city to be involved or localities to be involved. They just have to create the framework at the local jurisdiction to be involved. I struggled with getting out public comments. I created an entire interagency process to aggregate comments so that the Department of Health wouldn't send something separate from Cannabis NYC. It was a lot of work and a good portion of what we did. I think we submitted about 7 big comment packages. That is the first step. And I do think we also try our best to workshop them in our city state meetings.
Mhm.
So I did feel for a little bit we had some influence, but that's when the leader to leaders actually meet eye to eye and understand each other. If it's not the case, though, that happens in state and city, the only way you have it is some sort of legislative mandate that says you get to weigh in. And I think there are still, I don't think it's licensing, but I do think if you're approving people in my jurisdiction, it should be required that you send me who they are, what their address is, what their information is. I foiled that. I didn't get it. Still, it's a dark, circle. Like where is the actual information of my licensees? I'm lucky that I did a tour and I got most of that through, registration and da da da, but still very hard to verify. Those are the type of things that I feel like we're missing maybe in the MRTA that are like how state communicates to city and what are the mandatory reports and the mandatory things to help with enforcement, help with engagement too, because I could actually do direct outreach. As opposed to just ask the state, can y'all send this to your card list? Which we did a couple times and they did. So I'm not saying that the state wasn't a good partner when they could, but they couldn't give me just the data.
Mm.
And I feel like that was the biggest issue, data exchange and formal policy, like exchange points outside of public comment.
Now, I wanted to ask, so every cannabis control board meeting, someone gives some data, right? They talk about dollar sales, they talk about licenses that were issued. Um, What metrics would you use that would really sort of measure success for you?
Operationalizing. I like knowing the issued number of licenses because it shows to some degree what work output has happened as a result of the licensing team, right? And such. But it's really only maybe one team's KPI. The operationalizing of a business now starts to involve compliance and perhaps even the business support and the technical assistance departments. I would even say the policy area, because it isn't until people start to operationalize do you even determine if the policies or regulations you put in place are effective for what they need to do to operationalize.
Mhm.
So I would say operationalizing as a percentage of the issued licenses. So we could say all day we issued, 1,000 licenses, but if only 10 operationalized or
Mhm.
even 100, that
Right.
number is poor. And so that's the conversion rate. That's at least what I've been talking about. So that's one metric. The other is what I called and coined this in Portland is the return on equity investment. We have this cannabis tax revenue that the Cannabis Advisory Board is responsible for ensuring 40% goes back to communities disproportionately impacted. But we also have a large procurement budget that happens on the OCM side and MWBs that could be supported through that. To me, equity can come in many ways outside of just the licensing. It's licensing, it's procurement and how the office spends its money. It's the cannabis tax revenue and how that's used. What's the return on equity investment by our efforts all around on our portfolio of spending and all of the new resource that this industry brings? We're not measuring that yet. I haven't seen it in a report. And I do think that's something I would absolutely start to dive into because it was measurable in Portland after just 2 cycles of a small, very small grant fund by comparison to New York State.
All right. So finally, what's next for you?
Well, I got a lot of things going on. First, rest, recharge has been real. I could even see the difference in the bags under my eyes. I'm not gonna lie. Probably the rays too is looking a little blacker just on that alone, the fro. But I am really excited to finally be able to release my fourth edition of my best-selling workbook, How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry. It's been a bestseller on Amazon since 2019, and that is the third edition. And it really does take you from the rooter to the tutor, as my grandmother used to say, on most of the things that you need to know to enter the market. But more importantly, it has 100 questions that helps you kind of navigate it yourself. You can tell I was a homeschooling mom. I was like, I'm gonna make a workbook because people need to work to really navigate the industry. Well, the fourth edition is finally done. And also I don't work for the city anymore. So now I can publish it without an issue. And so that's really what's next up and big. But I'm also really excited to be doing some work with DASNY card licensees around some of the efforts that they have. We haven't forgotten what went down with DASNY. And I know we didn't talk about it much here. Maybe I'll come back after that develops a little bit more, but there are very specific issues that, again, this is not OCM related. I
Mhm.
always want to make sure we're clear. This is a different agency completely that we have to get to the bottom of. And the state does still need to provide restitution and make whole to the people that we say we were trying to help. And, in fact, we've actually harmed them again. And so I'll be doing some work there. You'll see me in the public realm supporting those efforts. But my workbook, How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry, is set to drop in June. I'm very excited, and that's the next up. If you're lucky, there may be other opportunities for me in more of a state global level. I think I'm going to be influential whether I'm in the private sector or public sector. So I've really just set on my sites that Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, as the chair,
Mhm.
will continue to do federal and state and where needed local support and leadership on insights and best practices. And so our third annual symposium is August 14th through the 17th in Boston. I want to invite you to come out as well. But we are still working and ensuring that the whole country is able to see the results of legalization from a reparative and restorative perspective.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you.
End on a high note with Nuna Harvest, Westchester's premier dispensary for all things cannabis. Stop in or hit up nunaharvest.com to explore today. That's it for this episode of Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from SimLab Media. Special thanks as always to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thanks for listening.